Good morning, everybody. I'm starting, and the Zoom is starting also. So all of your comments are being recorded to the outer world. And it is now being broadcast. Thanks, everyone, for joining. And we have one person on Zoom, so I'm going to make sure that comments and people are going to be looking at the recording. So if you have comments, questions, keep them to yourselves. No, say them loud enough so the people on Zoom and who watch the recording can hear it. And sometimes I'll repeat it. It's not because I have a cognitive problem, which I might have. It's just so that it's on the recording. So just bear in mind. Okay, so I am going to share my screen for the recording and the people on Zoom. What happened to share? Oh, there we go. And here we go. So if you haven't printed out the sources, it's on the WhatsApp group. You can also do something nifty and join the Zoom from your phone and then have the sources there. So this is meant to be kind of an introduction for a lot of you who have already been here last year. Some of it will be a review, but don't go crazy because each time, every time you look at something, you get something new out of it. And we're going in a little bit of a different direction, or something that I want to explore while we look at things this year. So for people who are new, people who were here last year, the guide for our classes is Rav Lau's, Sarah's cousins, Rav Lau, his book on the sages. And Rav Lau does something really brilliant and something I've never seen before, which is rather than look at Pirkei Avot as a morality text, which is, the way that we've been taught it and the way people usually discuss it, Rav Lau looks at it as a way of understanding Chazal, a way of understanding the original sages in terms of how what they say reflects a historical reality, a philosophical reality, shifts within contexts. Why does Shimon HaTzadik say A, and then generations later, Rabban Gamliel seems to say something different? Not from an ethical perspective, but how does it reflect the changing times and the changing perceptions and perspectives? So I use Rav Lau as a guide for that. But as you know, I take it into different directions. And also I'm very amenable to changing it, taking it into directions that you're interested in as well. So one of the things that I really want to look at this year in our course is something that's been, it's a prism from which to look at what the sages say, what Chazal say, and something that is a prism that has really characterized the way our thought leaders and we ourselves have looked at tradition, have looked at the development of tradition over time. And I think can be really compelling for how we look at change within tradition. And that is something called crisis discourse. And crisis discourse seems to be sort of a nascent field within philosophy. And not a lot of people talk about it, but there is a group of professors and thinkers at Tel Aviv University who have actually looked at it in terms of Rambam. And so I'm going to take a step back and try to explain what do I mean by crisis discourse. So many of you have heard of the idea of Shat HaDchak, right? Shat HaDchak means an emergency situation. So Shah from the time, Tchak is like a compelling emergency, an imminent situation is forcing you to do something that you normally wouldn't do. So halachic explanation of Shat HaDchak is a really famous explanation, actually, of that is Rav Yisrael Salanter in the 19th century. There was this came up quite a bit during COVID. Is it okay if we close the door? Is that okay for people in here? We can I find the kids, it's making me think I have to do something. So sort of instinct. Anyway, thank you. So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, at some point there was a plague that was, sweeping through Eastern Europe. And doctors at the time said people should be eating, like make sure to drink and eat enough during the day. They didn't have another answer to how to prevent the plague, but that was like, people should just make sure that they aren't starving themselves. It's important to be nourished. It'll help you fight off this plague. And it was a shat hatkach. It was really considered an emergency situation. So Rabbi Yisrael Salanter said, everybody should eat on Yom Kippur. And that's a huge thing to say, right? So in order to prove his point, he actually went to the Chatzer of the Beit Knesset, the outdoor courtyard, and sat down and ate a meal on Yom Kippur. And that's kind of like the kind of stories you hear about Shat HaChak. It's an emergency situation. I want to, he was making sure that people understood what an emergency situation was, and made sure that they understood that this was a unique exception. Okay, that's a good way of putting it, a unique exception. What crisis discourse says is that sometimes those kinds of responses happen within a historical context, and the change is, on the one hand, seems quite subtle, but on the other hand, can be seen as quite dramatic. Okay, so I know it's as we go today, we'll kind of unpack what I mean by that, and then what I'd like to look at is especially since the first year of this class really looked at sort of the heyday of Chazal, the beginning of the second Beit HaMikdash, the end of the Great Assembly, the end of the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, and then we had these Tanaim, the original generation of rabbis who developed the Mishnah, they didn't develop the Mishnah, but they're the ones quoted later as the Mishnah is written down. These rabbis who seem to have huge amount of political influence. Remember Shimon ben Shetach, whose sister was the queen, and he's sort of hiding out from the king in the basement of the castle, and all of this kind of intrigue. Slowly but surely, as Rome takes over this area and the Jewish community in Babylonia grows and develops, that kind of political, the central role that the Pharisees, the early rabbis, and then Chazal play in this area begins to diminish further and further until you get to the point of the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. And most of the people that we'll be looking at this year are people who are coming, who many of them lived at the time of the Beit HaMikdash and have had to survive the destruction. And then the next generation of their students who are having to, they're living in the aftermath of the destruction. So the people that we're looking at this year are really different from the people we looked at last year. And so that's why I thought it's important to look at it from that prism. How, imagine you're a librarian and your library is on fire. What do you do? How do you, what do you save first? And how do you deal with the aftermath? So, just imagining this room is on fire, which books do you pull out first? Which books, do you then say, I remember it, so I don't have to worry about it, and that kind of thing. So that's the kind of mentality that's happening with this next generation. So in order to set the tone, let's, again, don't kill me, we're going to look at that first Mishnah from Pirkei Avot, because I think it really sets the tone for everything. This is the most famous Mishnah of Pirkei Avot. There are lots of famous ones, but everybody knows this one, and we talked about it many times. And we have noticed how when you unpack it, new things come up. So Moshe kibel Torah miSinai u'Mosara leYoshua v'Yoshua l'Zkenim, Zkenim l'Nevi'im, u'Nevi'im Mesarua l'Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. This is setting the stage for everything that people learn outside of Torah. Basically, simply put, Moshe received the Torah at Sinai. Okay, understood. Moshe went up to Sinai and he received the Torah. But first question, what Torah did he receive, right? Whatever Torah he received, he transmitted it to Yoshua, his first number one student, Yoshua to the elders, the Zkenim, the elders to the prophets to the people of the Great Assembly, to the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. We can just say the men, there weren't any women, but anyway. So what do we learn from this very, very short Mishnah? What kind of truths are now established? we talked about last year, who's missing. So throw it out there. What are we establishing here? Yep, we knew that. Exactly. The Kohanim are missing, right? So here, all of a sudden, I say to you, the Kohanim are missing, and that's a real shocker, right? Because the Kohanim are mentioned all over the Torah. The Levi'im especially are mentioned all over the Torah as the stalwarts of maintaining tradition and maintaining ethical and moral behavior, right? When all of the Israelites join in on the Egel HaZahav, who is the only tribe that doesn't join? Levi, and who are called the teachers, the Kohanim. Eliezer, they're the ones who are passing on the tradition, the mysticism, the secrets of the true relationship with God as presented in the Torah, and yet they're missing. So off the very bat, I know I said that wrong. From the very first moment, we see something very important from this first Mishnah. Whoever wrote this Mishnah, or if this is just generally accepted, the rabbis said these kinds of things and it's generally accepted. I wanted to dedicate this year to your mother, Rosetta. Remember we talked about it and I meant to say it. Yes, it's been a year. So, frisky, feisty, wonderful woman. So right off the bat, we see something very interesting. The rabbis were very political. Okay, so rather than reading this as when I read it the first time in 5th grade, as like, this is how things were transmitted, all of a sudden you realize people are missing. The kings are not here, the prophet, the Kohanim are not here. That's huge. That's really huge. So the rabbis are making a political statement about how Torah and how learning and how tradition is transmitted. And it's not transmitted, it's transmitted with some and not with others. The other thing the rabbis are saying here, that Chazal are saying here, which is very interesting, is that we thought that Moshe went up and got those tablets, right? He threw them down, got another pair, and then over time you realize, well, no, it wasn't just that. It was also the Torah, like that we take out every week, that scroll, that was, maybe that was given to Moshe. But here we have this notion of transmission that is generally thought to allude to what? The Torah, the oral law, the Torah Shabbat Peh, the part that wasn't written down. And you get a sense of that, right? Because you get a sense of conversation, of teaching. So it wasn't that Moshe, like, what if you really wanted to say something about the Torah being passed down, it would have said Moshe took a scroll and handed it to Yoshua, and Yoshua handed that scroll over to this kid, like you'd have this transmission of a book, but there's no sense that there's a book. There's a sense that there's a corpus of learning. Maybe some of it's written, mostly it's oral, and it's being taught. It's being transmitted the way we're transmitting right now. I have some notes, I have some sources, but we're discussing, we're talking. It's a oral transmission. And so Yoshua gets the transmission, right? Also, there seems to be an order here, right? Like dot. But the Zkenim were living before Yoshua, and Yoshua is younger than the Zkenim, and the prophets are living at all different times, and the Zkenim and the prophets are living at the same time. But here we're given like this linear history. It's all very simple, guys. Don't worry about it. It was all transmitted just like this. It's very smooth, which also belies the fact that it's not smooth at all. So, and what else are we missing here? Destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, exile to Babylonia. It all sort of seems so perfect. The elders transmitted it to the prophets. We won't talk about what happened after the prophets. And then all of a sudden, here come the Anshe Knesset Agdolah, as though nothing happened, where we know a tremendous amount happened. Ezra came back, Ezra, who was a scribe and a Kohen Gadol from Babylonia, came back with Nehemiah came later, but whatever, and to rebuild a second Beit HaMikdash. And remember, it was terrible. He came here and half the people didn't even speak Hebrew anymore, which is an allusion to the fact that they had all intermarried. Tradition had been lost. Nobody knew the Torah. Remember what he implemented? Reading the Torah twice a week, which we do now. In other words, Shabbat, of course, but he started the reading of the Torah Mondays and Thursdays. And where was the Torah read? Where was the Beit Din? Where did they sit? At Rami Levi. They were at Rami Levi. So when you go to Rami Levi, guess what? You'd also hear the Torah. And why is that so important? Because nobody knew what was going on. So this was his way of transmitting, of saying, this is the law. And he also, remember what field was really good to be in the time of the beginning of the second Beit HaMikdash? What was like the best, get your kids to get into this field? Be a sofer, to write scrolls. And he had all sorts of rules about how you couldn't overpay soferim because you didn't want them to be so wealthy that they would want to stop working, or they could stop working. You didn't want that, no pension plans, which so like, you wanted them to keep working and working and working, because the more scrolls you wrote, the more people would have access to the learning. And he also started reinstating prayers and all sorts of things to get the community to become more cohesive. All that drama and the tension that was raised at the time, and the resurgence of the Kohanim back in the Beit HaMikdash, all of that is somehow just missing from here. So we get like a certain package of what was happening. Now, I want to move to source 2, and I quoted a lot of it, but you can ignore most of it. And I tried to bold what was important, and I'll just go through this very quickly. So this is the introduction of Rambam, of Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, which is the original code of, we always think of the Shulchan Aruch from the 16th century, right? No, 17th century. Yes, 16th or 17th century as being the code of Jewish law, but the Shulchan Aruch Rav Yosef Karo had a huge influence from Rambam, and till today, it is still considered to be somewhat of a halachic resource, but really fell out of power in terms of that because of the Shulchan Aruch. And we could have, hi Judy, we could have a lot of conversations about what Rambam was really trying to accomplish with the Mishnah Torah. My personal background comes from studying with Yitzchak Twersky, who claims that the Mishnah Torah is actually a preamble to the Guide of the Perplexed, and that rather than thinking of it as a halachic compendium, really we should be thinking of it as a proto-philosophical compendium. And so maybe next year our class will just be on unpacking Mishnah Torah as a philosophical text. But what's interesting about Mishnah Torah, Rambam lived 1135 to 1220. Some people say to 1204. I give him a few more years. He didn't have much else going on, so Halavai, he should have had more years. But anyway, what's interesting about Mishnah Torah is it's the only work of Rambam that's written in Hebrew. Everything else he wrote was written in Arabic or Judeo-Arabic. And so, and he's one of the earliest Jewish thinkers to be self-conscious about what he's trying to accomplish. So even the fact that he wrote an introduction is already, we didn't have introductions. Saadia Gaon has an introduction coming a century before Rambam. It was something that we learned from the Arabs. The Muslims started to write introductions to their religious and philosophical works. We weren't really doing it, but we picked up the habit from them. And you could do a whole year on just introductions, because introductions are this very intentional way that authors are saying, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. And so this is what I'm trying to do. And Rambam says explicitly, nobody has ever said that before. Rambam says explicitly in the Mishnah Torah, in the introduction, I'm writing this in Hebrew because I want everybody to be able to read it. I want this to be accessible to Jews living in Spain, as well as Jews living in France, as well as Jews living in Germany. And of course, the major problem with Rambam is that the major intellectual historical problem with Rambam is that, in fact, as soon as his Guide of the Perplexed is translated from Arabic into Hebrew, the Tosafot go and burn it, because it's so, nobody knew what it meant before. Nobody knew how to read it. And then all of a sudden they can read it and they're like, holy crap, this is really, this is burnable. So Rambam having the foresight to know that basically what he was trying to accomplish with Mishnah Torah was a few things. One, what happens when you take when I say a code of law, what is a code of law? What is, the Shulchan Aruch is a code of law. What does a code of law mean? What does that indicate?
Do this, don't do that.
Right. But as opposed to what?
The philosophical edge of it.
But okay, good. Very, very good. But as opposed to what, if you don't have the code of law, what are you doing? You're spending hours, if you're a scholar, what are you doing? You're spending hours a day learning Gemara, right? You're spending hours a day learning Gemara for what? To understand the law. Now, for people doing Daf Yomi, does studying Gemara get you any closer to understanding? I feel more confused than I ever was. And I feel like I can't do anything because oh my God, but what about this? What about this? What about this? It's very confusing. And also it makes the waters even more murky than they were before.
That's why,
It's
that's one of the reasons why they tell women not to learn Gemara. Because if you learn enough Gemara, if you don't know Gemara really well, no, it makes them.
Right.
Right. Not in a bad way. And it was very interesting, but it never brought a lot of questions to my practice, in my daily life.
Yes.
I felt like, who am I to, but the Gemara makes you.
So Toby's saying a little bit can be a dangerous thing. So that, if you really want to study Gemara, that's years and years and years of dedication to know all the ins and outs. And how many people are able to actually do that? Very, very few. We're not talking women or men, even amongst all the women and men who have the capability to study it, how many can get to the level where they can study Gemara and actually tell you at the end of the day, this is what you do when Erev Shabbat falls at 5 p.m. and you still have your chicken on the, whatever it is. You want to know tachlis, what do I do? Now, over time, Talmud study became a means, became an end to itself, right? And anybody who's studied Talmud knows that it can be very, very tantalizing. It can lead you into a world of thinking, of almost revealing secrets. It can be mystical in some ways, not in a Hasidic way, but mystical in an intellectual way, because you're really kind of like what we're doing with Pirkei Avot. You're unpacking ancient statements, and somehow or other, it reminds me of this. This was a gentleman who lived in Albany. Noah Losik was his name. He died at the ripe old age of 100. And he was one of these, businessman, and he'd survived the war, and he learned, and he continued to blow shofar till he was 95, one of these guys, in Albany, New York. People and other people have said that they've heard other people who have said this. So he may have picked it up from someone else. But whenever he was shaliach tzibor, whenever he led people in the davening, he would daven really, really fast, too fast. But and so people said to him, Noah, why are you in such a hurry? Why do you daven so fast? And he said, when I daven, God is listening to me. Why should I take God's time? God is listening to me. I want to make it short, quick. He has other things to do. He doesn't need to spend time listening to me. When I learn slowly, because when I learn, God is talking to me. I'm listening to God. And so there's this element when you're learning, when you get into it, that you're somehow touching the sacred, and you're also touching something of history. So the time that Rambam came around, that was a maslul, that was an avenue towards spiritual attainment, and we still have it today. You're in the base midrash, and you're learning, and you're learning, and you're steiging, and you're steiging. And to someone like Rambam, he sort of felt like that's maybe not the best way that you can attain intellectual connection with God, spiritual heights. What would Rambam have said? Rambam probably would have said the best way to do that is to study philosophy. Because if you're studying philosophy, if you're studying science, at that time, there was not a big distinction between philosophy and science. The natural sciences were philosophy. So if you can learn more about the way the world works, if you can learn more about the way our thought processes work, our way of understanding the world and understanding where we come from, and a historical perspective as well, that's a better way to know God. than to study Talmud. So that was Rambam's way. Like when Rambam said, you know what? You guys don't have to study for 40 years anymore. I'm going to put it into this. You can see it in a few weeks. Like if you want to really dedicate yourself, I'm giving you all the answers. You don't need to go into this kind of logical, illogical pathway into understanding what a bunch of rabbis thought. I'll tell you what the halacha is. And then you can have all the rest of your time to do the more important things. So Rambam, in saying, I'm writing this in Hebrew and giving his reasons for why he did it, was actually doing something quite shocking for the time, even though to us, we take it for granted, there's codes of law. Mm-hmm. So I want to take you through how he explains.
Was he not at all influenced by his time and what was going on historically? How many Jews were able to sit in this period when Spain and Portugal the Jews were in such upheaval then?
So he lived before that, but he lived before the Reconquista. So, but you're not wrong, because he himself, when we talk about the golden age of Spain, right? The golden age of Spain was like 1 second long. It was just that the Jews who happened to be there happened to put out a tremendous amount of literary output. So, and also it depends on where where you draw the line in terms of how you define it. So is Saadia Gaon part of the golden age of Spain? Probably not, but Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who was also writing on the run many times, Rambam writing on the run many times, but they had access to knowledge because they had the Arabic and they had the as opposed to the Jews who were in Christendom, who were closed off from everything that was happening around them, and they were no different than the usual peasant Christians. They didn't speak Latin. They didn't write Latin. They didn't understand Latin. So they were closed off from a whole intellectual arena. So to spend all their intellectual moments on Talmud, what else did they have? They didn't have anything else going on. So Rambam's milieu was just completely different from that point of view. But you are correct in terms of what you're saying. And we're going to get to that in a second. So A, he wrote it in Hebrew so everybody could understand it. B, he wrote it so that people could maybe free up some of their intellectual time, but he doesn't say that. What does he say? And now we're going to go back to that concept of crisis discourse. So he does not quote Pirkei Avot, but as people who know Pirkei Avot now, you know what he's basing this on. This is how he opens his Mishnah Torah. Okay. He says, Alpha Pisha lo nichtava Torah sheba'al peh. Limda Moshe Rabbeinu kula bebeit dino l'shivim zkenim. Even though the oral law, like our tradition, he calls it oral law, but it's really the tradition. Even though it was not written, Moshe taught it. Okay, so even though it was not written down, it's okay. Moshe taught it, and he taught it. And here it says Moshe gave instruction in its full scope at his tribunal seat to 70 elders. Whatever, he taught it to the Shivim Zkenim. Ve'alazar u'Pinchas ve'Yoshua shloshatan kiblu Moshe. So Moshe taught it to these 70 elders, and he also had 3 of his favorite students. He had Elazar, Pinchas, and Yoshua, and they actually had a little chabura with Moshe. So you're already seeing a hierarchy, right? They're the 70 elders, but they're the best students who have this chavruta with Moshe. Yoshua shehu talmido shel Moshe Rabbeinu, like and Moshe and Yoshua, who was like the top student, Masar Torah sheba'al peh v'tzivahu aleh. He in turn, so he Moshe taught Yoshua especially, and taught him how to derive halakha from it, like how to actually set up a legal system from it. V'chen Yoshua kol yemei chayav limed al peh. And Yoshua, for the rest of his life, continued to learn orally. So what do we have here that we didn't have in the first Mishnah? We have all these details, right? Rambam is all of a sudden putting faces to what we've been talking about. The first Mishnah in Pirkei Avot basically gives us very generalizations. Rambam is saying, no, these are real people. Not only were they real people, there was a hierarchy. It wasn't just the 70 elders. You had these students, and then even amongst the best students, you had the best student. And that best student, by the way, never had a book, which is interesting. That according to Rambam, he never had a book. He was doing everything orally. Okay, so just like Pirkei Avot sets the stage, Rambam is setting the stage.
And also, Elazar and Pinchas.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Excellent. Very, very good. They were Kohanim.
He didn't have a book, they didn't have the Torah scroll.
In other words, Rambam is emphasizing here. He's very careful about his words. He sets up very, very clearly. Yoshua understood it orally, and he passed it on orally. He may have had some, brochures. I don't know, but like the point is, Rambam is making very clear that this can continue to be an oral tradition. Very good point, by the way.
Yeah.
Very good point. That I hope you heard it on Zoom. That Sarah makes the point that the two second best students were Kohanim. Okay, now we don't have to go through this. What I wanted to just show you is that whereas in Pirkei Avot it says Nevi'im generally, Rambam goes through the entire history of who passed it on to whom. Eliyahu kibel me'achia, Achia Shilonu Beitino, Elisha kibel me'Eliyahu, Beitino, Yehoyada HaKohen kibel me'Elisha. So everything that we're missing, Rambam fills in the details, and you almost get a sense. Well, let's put that aside. I just wanted to point that out to you. It goes on for much longer. Rambam then goes through all the Zkenim and who they were, and like he builds a whole picture, a tapestry of all of the scholarship and transmission that's going on, until he gets to, and he goes through the rabbis, he goes through the Tanaim. It's actually very interesting if you ever have time just to see how history was very important to him, and he felt like he was recording a historical an analysis of transmission, which we really don't have in many places. So this was obviously a tradition that he received. Until the bolded part of this source, who do we get to? All of this is happening orally until we get to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda beno shel Rabban Shimon, zehu hanikra Rabbeinu HaKadosh, v'hu kibel me'aviv, Rabbi Elazar ben Shamua, Rabbi Shimon Chavero, until we get to Judah the prince, and until we get to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. And who was Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi? Who was he? He wrote down the Mishnah, okay? And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, we don't have a Mishnah saying why Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wrote down the Mishnah. He basically, in the let's say around 200 BC, 200 of the Common Era, the year 200. So he lived way after the Beit HaMikdash. He was not alive during the Beit HaMikdash. His father was Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who was the son of Rabban Gamliel, who was of the line of Hillel Hazaken, who people claim was, we can exactly. We have all of our the yichus. Okay, so here Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi did something very dramatic. To us, it doesn't seem very dramatic. But at the time, it was seen as the most dramatic thing to happen. He took this oral law, he took these traditions, and he wrote them down. They'd never been. Some of them have been written down here and there. In fact, we have Baraitot, which are considered wild. They're Mishnayot that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi didn't conclude. But he had a school. He had rooms full of scribes, and they would go through, they would talk about it, they would look at what existent scrolls there were, and they wrote it down. And that's our Mishnah. And from the moment it was written down, what did we start to develop? The Gemara. The Gemara is the commentary on the Mishnah. Both of them together equal the Talmud. And the Gemara gets written down almost, it doesn't get written down almost immediately, it doesn't actually get edited till many centuries later. But the idea that something is written down, and why did Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi include this, and why didn't he include this? And that's the source of the Gemara, because all those questions were around all the time. Like, why did someone say this, and why did someone say this? But the questions become much more acute when someone has actually made the decision to say, this is the Mishnah that will be included in the canon for eternity, and this is not. So all of a sudden you have all of the questions and ideas and confusion that develops in the Gemara. And so And speak loudly.
Were there politics about like, why did he write it down and maybe we should include this, not just why did we not include it?
Okay, so in terms of why he wrote it down, if there were if there was any resistance to him as a person writing it down, we certainly don't hear about it.
Or
As
what
a-
he did, yeah,
of what he did, yes. In fact, I believe it's a Masechet Chagiga. It doesn't come up in the Mishnah, it comes up in the Gemara, because once he's written down the Mishnah is done. So then the discussion of it comes later. And I think we'll take a class maybe to look at it, because it's very interesting, because the Gemara then quotes him as supposedly saying, or really saying, it's the biggest regret of his life. It was, but why did he do it? Why did he do it? So let's, and in terms of your second question, Rachel, what we have in the Gemara, not in the Mishnah is the Mishnah. The Mishnah, he wrote it down, it was set, it was frozen in time, okay? But then the moment he wrote it down, then there were a lot of questions about Toseftot and Braitot. Braitot, if you think of Or as bar or Chaye bar means wild. Braitot are basically statements, rabbinic statements that come from the same time as the Mishnah. They come from the Tanaim. They come from that original generation of rabbis who lived way before Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, but he's the one who's trying to put it all together. So statements from Rabbi Akiva, but then also statements from Shimon HaTzadik, or statements from Ezra even, that are considered opinions that, for whatever reason, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi did not include them in the Mishnah. And they're called Braitot because they're kind of living wildly around the edges. And so rabbis in the Gemara will bring it up all the time and say, well, the Mishnah quotes Rabbi Akiva as saying this, but we have a Braitot where he says the exact opposite. In the world of halachic decision-making, being able to say that you have a Mishnah or a Braitot or a Tosefta, which is similar to a Braita, to support your thinking is better than saying I have a quote from the Torah. Because a quote from the Torah is a drash. If you say, how do I know that I'm just making stuff up, but how do you know that I need a blue water bottle? Well, because it says in the Torah, blue is the priestly color. So that's how I know it. That's a drash. The Torah didn't say you need a blue water bottle. The Torah just said blue is the priestly color. Okay, so you just made a drash. Very nice. It's a very nice drash. But it's, if you can say, well, how do I know? Because there's a Braita where Rabbi Meir says very clearly you need a blue water bottle. That's precedence. That holds water. I didn't even intentionally do that. Okay, so that's like on one foot about that. But let's go to Rambam. Rambam says it explicitly to answer some of your questions, Rachel. So the part that's not bolded, right after the bolded part. V'lama asa Rabbeinu HaKadosh kach v'lo haniach hadavar kamot shehaya. Why did he just leave the status quo as it was? Everybody was happy, except lefi shera'a she'hatamidim mitma'atim v'hochim. So the students were leaving. It's kind of, it's, I think Toby was saying it before. In other words, how do you know that people can actually dedicate their time to this? If those numbers are diminishing, how are you going to keep up the transmission? It's going to stop. Why was that happening? He says it as additionally, but it's also why. The Romans, were in full force. The Jews were being dispersed out of Eretz Yisrael. Jews were mainly in Babylonia, but in other places as well. Communication was difficult. All of these things were threatening the ability to keep these things going. The evil, Romans, they were only growing stronger, and eventually Christianity, and that's going to just become worse and worse. And Israel, the Jews are being dispersed all over the world. So what did he do? Kadei sheyilmaduhu b'mehera v'lo yishkach. So he wrote it into one compendium that's available to everyone. Everyone can open it and learn it. So what's interesting is that on the one hand, you have the elitist notion that Moshe is just teaching his favorite students, and they're passing it down one to one. And here he's saying something different. He's saying, actually, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, by the way, Rambam is doing something very interesting here, right? Rambam wrote his Mishnah Torah in Hebrew, not just Hebrew. He says it very clearly, but I didn't quote it here. I wrote it in Mishnaic Hebrew. What's interesting about Mishnaic Hebrew? For people who have learned Mishnah, when we look at Pirkei Avot, what's interesting about Mishnaic Hebrew? It's a very accessible Hebrew. Okay, it's much more accessible than Aramaic. But like if you compare Mishnaic Hebrew to biblical Hebrew, how many of you sit, especially during the months of Vayikra and Shul, listening to the Parsha, and every other word, it's like, what? Whereas if you sit down with Pirkei Avot, you sit down with Mishnah, you can actually understand it. It's not so different than modern Hebrew. And by the way, sorry, going into all directions, Eliezer ben Yehuda, when he was really the force behind modern Hebrew, says the same thing. He says, I'm not using biblical Hebrew, I'm depending more on Mishnaic Hebrew. Mishnaic Hebrew is considered salul. It's considered clear and easy to understand. So Rambam here is doing something very interesting. He's saying, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi wrote it in a book that would be accessible to all. He doesn't refer to the language, but he himself says, not in the next paragraph, but he himself is comparing himself to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He's saying, I decided to write Mishnah Torah in Hebrew and not in Arabic because he has a sense of, language is dependent on where you're living. But if you're Jewish, you're going to, at some point, have some Hebrew knowledge. And so this Mishnah is going to be accessible to you, just as Mishnah Torah is going to be accessible to you.
So Rambam goes to the trouble of talking about the tradition, Moshe Rabbeinu and whatever. I'm wondering, I know nothing about Rambam at all, with this very little, other than the fact that his stuff was dissed, and it was only Ramban around 100 years later who brought the whole thing back. But aside from that,
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting point. We should get to that. Yeah.
Right. I'm wondering if in any way or anywhere Rambam actually points out his own yichus, as it were, his own
Interesting
yichus. Where does he get his stuff from?
Yes.
That it became unacceptable, as it were.
Yes. Okay, so Sarah's asking if Rambam ever does the same thing to himself.
Yeah.
Because he sets up Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi clearly as the inheritor of this. So yes, not to the same extent, because I think he was a little too egotistical for it, but he didn't want to set himself into a specific tradition. Mainly because he had a lot of criticism of the Gaonim. The Gaonim, not Sadia specifically, but the Gaonim that came at the very, very end of the redaction of the Gemara, like Chai Gaon and those people. He felt that there were indications that he felt that they were corrupt, or that they had lost a lot of the transmission, or that there were issues with them. So he sometimes sets himself apart. That isn't to say that he doesn't give credit to his teachers. Here and there, he gives credit to his teachers, but he does it in a much broader way, because as you'll see, he sets himself up as the second Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi. That's the whole point of this. That's what, because for you have to stop and say, why is Rambam giving us all this information? If you have a hakdama to write, why are you spending pages and pages talking about transmission? And then you're concluding with, and Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi wrote it down. And here's the reasons why he wrote it down. And he was saintly. He was holy. He was a holy person for writing it down. Why is he saying all this?
Back himself up, so that-
To back
that is
himself up.
okay what he's doing.
Exactly,
In
exactly.
this generation, there's also a need.
And that's his pedigree. That's his pedigree. Now let's turn it back to what we were talking about. Shat Hatchak, the moment, the emergency moment. So he sets it up for Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He said he definitely did the right thing. Oh, and I don't have the source here. Anyway, he sets up Rabbi Yehuda Nasi as doing the right thing. What I didn't include here, which I meant to include, and I guess I wanted to get carried away with Hill and Shammai, which we'll do next week. It's okay though. I don't think we needed to really look at it inside because it's very verbose. And that may be the reason I didn't include it here. Rambam basically then goes on to show how things got lost. So Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wrote it down. Everybody knew it. And then we have the development of the Gemara, blah, 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 blah. But then he starts to criticize the generations before himself. Things started to fall apart. Things were losing focus. The transmission is being broken. And so he doesn't say it explicitly, but he gives it as a motivation for, and of course, in his time, the political threats that are happening, he ends up leaving Spain to go to Fez, then to go to Egypt, stopping very shortly in Eretz Israel, but not staying for more than 10 minutes, and then, off to Egypt. And he himself is living that life. And so he very much identifies with Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. But what I'm interested in is the fact that he casts both his project, his intellectual project, and Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's intellectual project identically. They're both identical. It's what we're talking about in terms of crisis discourse, because nothing is happening that someone on the street would recognize. No one out there is recognizing what's happening, but the people in the Beit Midrash, the people who are learning these texts, the people who are devoting their lives to it, this is no subtle shift. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi writing down all of the Mishnah, and then centuries later, Rambam writing a halachic code so that you don't need all those books on that shelf, you just need this. Those are revolutionary responses. And what's interesting about it is that Rambam may have had a lot of motivations. That goes back to your point from before, Sarah. We say Rambam's motivation could have been dedicate your time to something more important like science and philosophy. But that's not how he casts it. He casts it as this is a crisis. We're losing information, and if I don't write it down, it's going to be lost. So Rabbi Yehuda Nasi does the same thing. He's less self-conscious about it, but he never says, I want to make learning accessible to everyone. The idea is we're losing it. If we don't write it down, we're losing it. And I think for a moment, I think it's just really interesting to think about the revolution of writing, the revolution of putting something down on paper. And this is really the way I want to look at things this year, because we talked about this last year also. As we get towards the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash and its aftermath, I think that something we should be looking at every statement in the light of the loss of memory, and it's not just the loss of tradition; it's the loss of memory. And so when you get a sense that you have a chain of transmission and you have a chain of discussion that's happening, but that there are breaks and there are things that people can't remember, it's not just, oh, I don't know where my keys are. It's a tragedy. It's an utter tragedy. And so almost everybody that we're going to be looking at this year will either be coming from the Hillel camp or the Shammai camp. And the way that we have always looked at Hillel and Shammai, this is the last thing I'll say about it for today. The way that we have always looked at Hillel and Shammai is that Hillel's the good guy and Shammai's the bad guy. Hillel, he's, into lighting more Hanukkah candles, and Shammai's like a meanie and says, no, you have less. But at the end of the day, what I really think the discord between Hillel and Shammai is about, it's about how you deal with memory loss and loss of that connection. And you see in Shammai, in terms of the things that Shammai Hazaken, the original Shammai said, and later his students, and I wouldn't say it's Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel necessarily, just because those are the students who are coming later, and they just like to have a borgus, and whatever we can argue about, let's argue about. I'm talking about Shammai and Hillel as the original initiators, the people who lived during the time of the second Beit HaMikdash. They still lived in the time of having the Beit HaMikdash without Jewish sovereignty, because the Hashmonaim are long gone, right? They're living at the time of Herod, which is just confusing. They don't have a lot of political force, but they have learning. And Shammai desperately holds on to tradition, holds on to learning, and holds on to memory. And we know it as halakha l'Moshe Sinai, right? Halakha that nobody. What is halakha? When you say, how do we know the answer to this? Oh, it's halakha l'Moshe Sinai. It was halakha that was given to Moshe at Sinai. That is the biggest cop out, right? You're not saying why you know it, how you know it. You're saying, oh, it's a tradition. But for Shammai, it's the gold standard, because it means that he has a tradition that follows all of this transmission. Whereas Hillel, what does he do? Hillel starts introducing creative legal analysis. He starts introducing hekesh, where you can compare one halakha or one pasuk to another pasuk. Gzera shava, where you can compare one word to another word, and thereby gain. He introduces creative analysis, so that if you're living 200 years later and you don't know why we light candles the way we do on Hanukkah, well, you can figure it out. You can use these legal tools. So you don't necessarily need memory. Not that memory loss isn't a tragedy for both of them. I just think that Hillel positioned himself much better to contend with memory loss than Shammai did. And that's one of the reasons we find so many times Shammai is right, like his student, Eliezer ben Horkanus with the bat kol. His students are right, but they're rejected because memory is not eternal. Creativity is. So that's another way we're going to be looking at things this year. So
Wow.
Actually,
yes.
could you send that timeline that you had?
Yes,
later?
you know what, I was thinking of doing it today, and I thought, you know what, I don't want to, if there are new people, I don't want to overwhelm them with timelines. So we'll start with the timeline next week,
Okay.
and then we can set the tone. Now, there's part of what we didn't do this week on the source sheet, and we did it last year, and I only wanted to look at something very brief from it. So if you printed it out, keep it for next week. We'll do it. Oh, you have the timeline. Show everyone your timeline. You get the star. Yeah. Naomi brought her timeline. So okay, everybody. So yeah. Why not?
I hate to go back because you ended in such a beautiful place, but it's kind of to do with what Rachel was saying. Was Yehuda Hanassi met with this same resistance and shock and horror as
We
Rambam,
assume, we don't know.
and
exactly.
how long it took to normalize.
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. So what I would like to do for that, we're going to get to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi eventually this year, if not next year. I don't know what our plans are, but maybe we'll have him jump the queue a bit to look at this, if people are interested, because he doesn't come for a long time.
Yeah, I was wondering.
Yeah. He does show up in his own Pirkei Avot, which he was the one who was editing it, but then that seems to be a really good entree to look at that. Now, the thing is that from this point on, we are not going to be looking at the drama of writing things down, because it doesn't happen until later. We'll just be looking at the Mishnayot, but it's very interesting. All right, everybody, I'm going to stop recording. Thank you. I'm so glad you could make it.